In today's lecture, I will talk about the relationship between cinema and painting. Cinema can be understood in terms of movement and moving images. Painting, in comparison, talks about a frozen moment. So, in a painting, we do see actions, emotions, characters, things happening, but they are frozen in a particular space and time. Seen from this perspective, the difference between cinema and painting can be seen to be quite wide. But it is also fruitful to look into the congruences, the similarities, and the influences cinema has drawn from painting. In the first half of the lecture, I will indicate towards some of the basic differences between the two medium, and then I will go on to describe how the different kinds of painting have influenced cinema. As I have been saying, cinema is all about movement. It shows moving images. Editing is the essence of cinema according to many scholars and critics, because what happens is 2-3 shots are joined together to produce meanings. And in each shot we see a character moving from one space to the other, traveling across time. So 3 disjointed time zones and space are brought together through editing. Fragmented pieces are brought together to create a coherent meaning. In case of painting, it is different. Everything can be seen within one particular frame. Whether it's an action, whether it's a landscape, it is present to us, given to us in one particular frame. Andre Baza has a very interesting essay called Cinema and Painting, in which he analyzes how a film on painting or a painter somehow tries to discard or to destroy the essence of painting. He actually indicates towards a debate which have emerged while talking about the difference between cinema and painting. He says that because cinema is about fragmentation and painting is not, painting talks about a different kind of unity. So if one tries to show a painting through a camera, it does injustice to the painting. Because a painting is then broken up into small fragments. We move close to the painting, we can see it through a close-up, then we can see it through a long shot. In real life, this doesn't happen. There is no camera to intervene between the viewer and the painting. So camera is there. Secondly, painting is shown through fragmentation. Another thing is the function of the frame of a film screen and the frame of a painting. In case of a painting, the frame is not just for decorative purposes. It creates a difference between the painting and the real world outside. So, if a painting is depicting a war, or maybe a mythological episode, or even an ordinary everyday life scene, it is differentiated, distinguished from the reality in which the painting is situated. So we can see the frame and it kind of creates a distance between the viewer, the reality, and the painting. But also, it distinguishes between the reality which is itself being represented by the painting. So, Baza explains it in these terms that even if there's a war sequence or whatever being depicted in the painting, it's just a microcosm of the macrocosm. It is not to be understood as a continuation. In contrast, the frame of a film, it infuses a kind of centrifugality. When we look at an image in a film screen, the frame is not the edge of the image. It gives us an impression as if whatever we are seeing on screen is continued outside the frame as well. So the orientation of the space is outward. We tend to move outward in case of a film screen, whereas in a painting, there's a centripetality. We tend to move inward. The orientation of the space is inward, and this is how the frame of a painting and the frame of a film screen are completely different. And yet, Baza says that there is a kind of democratization which happens because of cinema. So some of the world's best painting or most important paintings are confined in museums which are not accessible to all kinds of people. Whereas cinema is much more democratic. It has a wider reach to a wider audience, which is why one doesn't need to be trained or initiated or knowledgeable about painting. He or she can access those paintings through cinema, which is why to him it is actually not fruitful to talk about how cinema destroys painting. More so because cinema is a different medium, it has got its own specificity. The moment we try to transfer a painting to the cinema, surely it destroys some of the core characteristics of painting, but on the other hand, it makes the painting accessible to a wider audience. Let's talk about the realist painting and how it influenced cinema. The realist movement in arts began in the middle 19th century. Now, the movement emphasized on a truthful depiction of everyday reality and depiction of the ordinary people, their mundane life in full detail. So, unlike the mythic characters or fictional characters, realism was talking about the individual and how he and she perceives the outer world. So, some of the basic principles of realism, whether in literature or in painting or in architecture, was an eye for detail, an objective depiction of the world as an individual perceives it. In terms of painting, thus, what became important was drawing human anatomy in full detail so that the figures that we see in a painting appears real to us. Using the light and shade, using the color to create an illusion that we are seeing a real object, just the way we'll see a real object. It should be noted here that the tendencies of growing realist art can be marked in the ancient Greek as well, when the people were trying to draw the human anatomy. They were studying human anatomy closely. Or trying to draw a landscape with full detail was developed in Italy. And also during the Renaissance, when oil painting came into vogue, the painters got a chance to portray the light and shade and the different ways of perceiving the world in full detail, much more vibrant possible manner. But in the mid-19th century, with all these tendencies crystallized to give birth to a movement which is known as a realist movement in art. I would like to talk about two paintings. In the first one, we can see it's a fantasy land created with some mythic figures, but however, the pillars, the column, the corridors, the whole mansion is drawn in full detail. We can see each of the etchings and the color in full detail. The way the light and shade has been handled, the treatment of the light and shade is also gives us an impression as if we are seeing real objects. And in the second painting, which is a famous one, it's called The Last Supper, same thing happened. The human body, whether of Christ or of the other people who are standing beside him, are drawn in a detail, in a manner as if which gives us an impression as if we are seeing real people. The objects on the table, the wall, and everything bears a resemblance to the actual everyday life. One of the significant features of this realist painting is perspective. Now, what is perspective? Perspective is an approximate representation of the objects on paper as one perceives them through real eyes. So if I am standing here, the objects closer to me will appear bigger. The objects which are far from me appears to be smaller. Also, the dimension of the space and the shapes and the objects appear in different manner. There is a gradation of space which happens due to perspective. Perspective painting became one of the significant features of realist painting. Now, in earlier times, the objects were shown in terms of the hierarchy or the social position or spiritual importance. So, characters of spiritual importance were drawn in bigger sizes. The characters of lesser importance were thrown at the back. There was no gradation of space, there was no perspective. It didn't look real to us. Perspective gave us a chance of representing the objects, the characters, the faces, the space in such a manner that it gives emphasis to an individual, and that is another very important aspect. Things are being depicted from the point of view of an individual. So if I am standing here and I am looking at the object placed in front of me, the dimensions in which they would appear in the naked eye, painting tries to approximate the objects in the similar manner. Now, the two of the most leading painters of the realist art movement are Gustave Courbet and Jean-François Millet, and I would like to mention some of their paintings to show how these tenets were being expressed in their painting. Image 1, we can see two beautiful ladies sitting. Their body, some parts of their body are naked. The body part have been drawn in full detail. The light, the way it falls on their face, their cloth, the way they are intertwined, the way they are sitting, everything gives us an impression as if we are looking at a person in blood and flesh. The second image is called the Stonebreakers. As we say that one of the principles of realist movement was to talk about ordinary man, how they lead their life everyday reality and incidents which happen every day in front of our eyes, to look at them in much more detail, to look at them with much more attention. Stonebreaker is one such painting where we find two workers. They're working, they have a back to the audience or one who is perceiving. We cannot see their face though, but their hands, the movement, the pressure they are giving to break the stone, the landscape, all give us an impression about their social status, about their life, about their job. Similarly, Francois Millet's paintings of the potato planters once again talks about a particular class of worker, and the way and you can see the posture in which they are picking up plucking the potato, and also they are handling the sacks, and they're handling the toiling in the field. The second one is called the shepherdess, and here also we can see a beautiful use of the perspective. So the flock of sheep is standing there, she's standing in the foreground. We can see some vegetation and the trees at the far end of the painting, and we can see the vanishing point there. Just as in the picture of Last Supper, similarly here, the vanishing points are quite clear. In case of Last Supper, if we look at the painting, Christ stands in the center of the image with both the hands stretched. So both the hands work as the base of the triangle through which we approach the vanishing point. The vanishing point can be seen to be somewhere right at the center of his forehead. In similar manner, the window at the back of Christ we can see the vanishing point merging somewhere there in the horizon, and the window helps us to locate that vanishing point. Similarly, in the painting on the shepherdess, whereas the woman is standing in the foreground and the flock of sheep is standing at the back, the trees at the back of far end of the picture, it gives us a sense of the diminishing, of the foreshortening of the images. They're not only shorter in comparison to the image which is in the foreground, but also it highlights the vanishing point in the image. Now, in case of cinema, there are few examples which show how perspective have been used in cinema. Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window is a fine example. Now, the story is about a person called Jeffrey who has met with an accident and is injured, so he can't move. He sits on the wheelchair, but he passes his time by looking at what the neighbors are doing. He sits in front of the window and looks through his camera, through his lens, to the apartments. So if we see in the following shots, we can find he's sitting and looking at looking outside the window. There are small windows, and the figures in those windows are even shorter because those are at a distance. Those are at a distance, and there are buildings which are even further, and even we can only see the contours of the building, and we can see that they're much more shorter than the person who is sitting in the foreground. Also, there is another shot where we can see the face of the main character, Jeffrey, and is looking at something going on in the apartment. It's a crime thriller where Jeffrey, just by sitting in his room and just by looking at what the people are doing in the neighborhood, in the apartment in front of his own house, he discovers something wrong is happening and he traces a murder. So in this particular shot, we find he's looking at a woman through his lens. So we can see his face and the circular lens and the image of the woman, which is short, and yet we can get the feeling that he is looking at the image through a lens, which is why the image is appearing bigger than it should be.
I thought Doyle would be here by the time the trunk left, or I'd call the police. Now we're going to lose it.
Throughout the film, Hitchcock shows us how perspective can be shown in cinema, how just by positioning an individual viewer, how the objects, the spatial configuration of the objects can be determined in relation to that particular viewer. Now, another feature that one needs to consider in this respect is the deep focus and the depth of field, and the deep focus photography, the technique which was championed in the realist cinema. Now, what is deep focus? Deep focus is a technique in photography in which the foreground and the background, the objects that we place in the foreground and the background of the frame, everything is in focus. Everything can be seen clearly. Citizen Kane is, of course, one of the finest films in which deep focus photography has been utilized. We can see a large field, a depth of field, a large field has been considered. So in the first shot, we can see a woman sitting in the foreground with her back towards the camera. We can see that, first of all, her figure is bigger than the person who is standing afar. It's giving a sense of the perspective, as we have been talking, that from the viewer, the woman is closer to the viewer, whereas the other person is standing at a distance from the viewer, which is why his figure is shorter. But at the same time, we can see that we can get the sense of the fact that the room in which these characters are sitting and are standing is quite a spacious room, because everything can be seen in full clarity, and the way the light and shade has been used, it foregrounds, it underlines the vastness or the breadth, length and breadth of the room. So on one hand, the deep focus photography help us to see each of the object in full clarity, the pillars, the sofa, the curtains, the face, the contours, each thing in clarity. At the same time, they heighten the sense of perspective. It shows us how things appear closer and smaller depending on the individual viewer and how he or she is perceiving things. So far, we have been talking about the realist movement and how the realist painting has influenced cinema. We must remember there are other kinds of cinema came into being also, and they borrowed from other paintings and other art movement. Let me talk about Surrealism and German Expressionism in this context. Now, German Expressionism is a part of the Expressionist movement which grew in Germany before the First World War. It grew as a reaction, as a response to realism. So whereas realism was trying to depict things objectively with full detail and as is perceived by an individual, German Expressionism thrived on a kind of stylization. It talked about giving a voice to the inner turmoil, what one is feeling inside. So it doesn't have to be realistic, but a depiction of exactly the feeling, the moods that one is going through in his or her own mind. So unlike realism, German Expressionism emphasized on the use of bold colors, different shapes, geometric figures, and stark contrast of light and shade. If we look at some of the black and white painting to begin with, we can see how, while portraying an individual character or even a landscape, the realist tenets are completely discarded. There is no need to show things in full detail. Only through some brush strokes or through some random lines and curves and structures, a landscape is drawn. We can understand it to be a landscape, but at the same time, we can get a sense of some other kind of emotion coming out of the painting. If we look at the facial expressions, we can see agony, we can see fear, we can see horror, we can see terror, but none of the faces are drawn in the realist detail or the way a human figure would be drawn in the realist painting. But we can get a sense of the inner turmoil. In this respect, one must talk about one of the famous painting by Edward Munch. It's called The Scream. Now we can see a person standing and he's closing his ears. Is it a he or is it a she? Is it a woman or is it a man? You cannot decipher that from the costume because they are not realist. It gives you just an impression of a human figure. The faces and the eyes and the expression tells us that he's horrified. He's angry, or maybe he's horrified, which is why he's screaming, and the painting is called a scream. But what is the reason? It's not explicated. The background also uses stark colors like red. It might be a sky, it might be a nature. We don't know where he or she is standing. There are use of colors like yellow, orange, and red at the background, and other objects are not shown in clarity. We are not given a sense of exactly where he or she is standing. The emphasis is just on a particular emotion and how one can depict that emotion through some stylized brush strokes and color. Similarly, another painting can be mentioned in this context. It is called Gerard der Canal by Egol Schiele. It also shows a particular canal, but the way the canal has been depicted, we can see use of some bold, very bold brush strokes, stark contrast of light and shade, and some peculiar shapes and sizes. Now, these features, which are the salient characteristics of German Expressionism, have been used in cinema, German Expressionist cinema. And in this context, I will mention about 3 films. The first one is Nosferatu by Murnau, which released in 1922. The second one is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari by Robert Weiner, which released in 1920. And finally, Metropolis by Fritz Lang, which released in 1927. In each of these shots, as we can see, black and white has been used. Bold, heightened emotions and expressions of the characters are used. If we look at the background or the set designs, we can see triangles, squares, rectangles, vertical lines, which are being used constantly instead of a realist background. That is, we don't use realist furniture or clothes. And also in the sequence from Metropolis, we can see, whereas he's trying to show us a sequence of a city or busy city life, even then the building, the car, the way the structures have been drawn are quite abstract. They do convey a sense of emotion, although, but then it is not conveyed to us in the typical realist style. The second movement I'm going to talk about is Surrealism, which emerged in 1920s. Now, Surrealism came out of Dadaism, a movement which was an anti-art movement. The word anti-art was first coined by Marcel Duchamp, and Dadaism grew around 1914 and 15 as a reaction to the bourgeois sense of logic and reason. Now, the argument of the Dadaist artist was that the bourgeois sense of logic and reason have only given result to a war, and the war has on the other side signaled the collapse of such reason, which is why one has to celebrate chaos, one has to celebrate irrationality, which is why these artists once again discarded the tenets of realism. They were not interested in objectively looking at the things, looking at our nature, looking at our surroundings. They were not interested in depicting things as they appear to be, but as one would want them to be, or the other side of the reality, that is the chaos, the irrational, the space of non-logic which lies at the core of the logic and reason as we perceive it. A new kind of aesthetics grew out of Dadaism, which was later carried forward in Surrealism. Surrealism actually concentrated on the dreams. So, just like Dadaism was talking about irrational and logic, Surrealism talked about what we see in dreams, what we perceive in dreams, an emotion, an object, a scene, whatever it is. The things that we perceive in dreams were given space on the painting canvas. One of the leading painters of surrealist movement was Salvador Dali, and if we look at his paintings, we see he uses some familiar objects like a clock, a horse, a human figure, a cupboard, a room, but the way they are depicted, there is a kind of distortion which happens. The shapes are distorted, the colors are changed, and the context in which they are placed, the context and the relation in which each object is placed in relation to the other, it gives us a different meaning. It appears to be absurd to a certain extent. We do not see them in the manner in our real world, but the surrealists were interested in seeing what we perceive in dreams and then directly depicting those objects and those scenery through their painting. Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel, one of the leading surrealist filmmaker of the time, collaborated on a film which is called Ancien Andalou. It is very difficult to find a narrative, a realist narrative in the whole film. There are some very stark and strong images which are woven together to convey a particular sense. Another facet of surrealism was giving importance to psychoanalysis, because since they were talking of dreams, and we know that by that time Sigmund Freud had already championed his theory of psychoanalysis and of the unconscious, surrealists similarly tried to unearth the unconscious through their painting. So they said that the image that we see in our dreams can only be analyzed through psychoanalysis. They should not be understood as symbolizing something else. In the film Ancien Andalou, there are two stark sequences. One is cutting of the eye through a razor. So a woman is staring straight to the camera. The man is slitting the eye by a razor. This particular shot is juxtaposed by a moon which is being engulfed by some cloud. Now, what meaning does it exactly convey? Does it symbolize a particular meaning? It is hard to tell. It can, because this particular image, it is said, was seen in a dream, and Buñuel just depicted that particular dream scene onto the screen. There is another sequence where the hand, the palms are filled with ants. Now, Salvador Dali was said to have seen it in a dream. said, work at the two starting images from which the whole film was developed. Now, these two images are not symbolizing any one particular thing. They only make meaning when they are seen in context to one another, and also they are only seen if one tries to analyze them through psychoanalysis. They come out from dream, they come out from our unconscious. They reveal something about our unconscious which cannot be understood through understood in a way we perceive the real world, or in a way we depict the real world. Now, so far we have talked about the art movements happening in the West and how it has affected cinema, which has come out in the West. One must take into account that Indian painting, different schools of Indian painting, has also influenced Indian filmmakers. In this context, I'll briefly mention about the pot painting or the Kalighat painting. Now, it is a particular school of painting thriving in Bengal in the 19th century, where the painters would draw on a piece of cloth or on a scroll. They basically drew mythic figures, mythological figures of gods and goddesses, or the incidents taken out of Puranas and stories and epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata. So basically there are a number of shots, maybe figures of the gods and goddesses or the incidents, which are drawn one after the other, like each shot in a particular cloth, and they are scrolled. They are drawn on a scroll. So these painters also used to move from one village to the other, and as they showed the scroll, they would sing and dance. This formed one whole performance. So the meaning of what one can see on the scroll, on the pot, is also understood in terms of the singing and the dancing which accompanied such painting. Now, this particular tradition of pot painting, the features were adopted by Ritik Ghatak in Subarnarekha. If we look at the very opening credit, we find that the name of the film, the whole credit of the film, it appears on a piece of long vertical piece of paper, white paper, in a scroll. And somebody is opening the scroll. Somebody is constantly opening the scroll, and we can see the name. The borders are decorated, just as in the pot painting or the scroll painting, the borders were decorated with floral designs or some other kind of design. There was no perspective, as we have been describing in the realist painting. There is no perspective. There is no realist depiction of the body or of the costume. But there is a stylized depiction of the faces, of the costume, of the landscape. There is a flattening of the space where the figures appear nearly close to one another, sometimes one on top of the other. We cannot really understand the delineation of space, or whether one is closer to the viewer or one is far ahead. So it's a different kind of aesthetics which came out of the Kalighat pot painting. In Subarnarekha, in the credits also, first of all, the names are written in Indian calligraphy, in Bengali, in the Indian calligraphic style. Several films of his uses this Indian calligraphy in the credits. For example, be it in Pother Pachali or in Opu Shongshar, we find a frame which is decorated and the name of the whole film and the credit appearing in such Indian calligraphic style, which are reminiscent of Indian pot painting. So this is how we have seen that whether in the West or in the East, the different schools of painting have influenced visual aesthetics in cinema.